This is The Raid, exposing the dark world of America's deportation machine. I'm your host, John Carlos Frey. Nick Scwellenbach is a senior investigator at Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. He's previously been the communications director at the U.S. Office of Special Counsel, the main federal agency in charge of protecting whistleblowers. He also served on a 3-person government team that evaluated whistleblower allegations of abuses of authority, violations of journalistic independence, and other claims involving the first Senate-confirmed CEO at the U.S. Agency for Global Media. He was also a senior fiscal policy analyst with the Center for Effective Government, a staff writer with the Center for Public Integrity, and a reporter-researcher for Harvard University's Nieman Watchdog. His journalism has been published in The Washington Post, Time Magazine, Rolling Stone, The New Republic, The Intercept, Politico, The Daily Beast, Yahoo News, Mother Jones, and the Texas Observer, and as well as other media outlets. His investigative findings have been widely covered by major media outlets and are routinely cited by members of Congress conducting oversight. On today's part 2 with Nick, and this time we're going to be speaking about Stephen Miller, an article that Nick wrote about Stephen Miller's investments. You're going to want to hear this. I was fascinated by the Stephen Miller article, mostly because we know Stephen Miller to just kind of be this staunch anti-immigrant, if I can use that term, architect of what we're seeing here. But reading your article and doing a little bit of homework, there's a lot more to it. I mean, there's some corruption, there's some money dealing here. I'm also aware of Stephen Miller's association with Project 2025. If you read Project 2025's background on immigration, what we're seeing today is pretty much what was in that before this ever started. And Stephen Miller had his hand in what we're seeing today. So maybe you could just start at the beginning and kind of bring up Palantir, and I'll just let you run with this.
Yeah. I've spent many years looking at immigration and customs enforcement, particularly their contractors and the companies they do business with, and potential ethics and conflict of interest concerns related to some of those relationships. Stephen Miller is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Homeland Security in the Trump White House. He is one of the most powerful people in this administration. He was in the first Trump term. He goes back a long way. He worked for, then Senator Jeff Sessions. He helped to sink major immigration reform legislation that had a lot of bipartisan support, either during the late George W. Bush administration or early part of the Obama administration. So Stephen Miller has this sort of long track record of pushing these hardline immigration policies. I was on a vacation at the beginning of June, and first day back from vacation, I got some records from a request that I had made to the Department of Homeland Security, showing that this other official, Paul Ingrassia, who's an interesting person in his own right, had a financial stake in Palantir. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Paul Ingrassia, he was the Homeland Security liaison to the Trump White House. And I was like, oh, DHS and ICE, they use Palantir a lot. And so at first I was like, okay, I'll do a little piece on Paul Ingrassia and this interesting connection. But it prompted me to look at other White House staffers' financial disclosures, which had just been released on a really obscure part of the Trump White House's website. They didn't make it easy to find, but somehow I stumbled across it. And looking at Stephen Miller's financial disclosure, I mean, I was a bit stunned to find that he had a $250,000 stake, or up to a $250,000 stake in Palantir. And that is especially notable with Stephen Miller. They did this big contract award with Palantir this spring to launch something called Immigration OS. OS usually stands for Operating System, to sort of expand ICE's capabilities. ICE and Palantir have a contracting history that goes back many years, but this sort of expanded it so that they could track in real time self-deportations and sort of other things to inform policy. And keep in mind here, Stephen Miller is sort of running the policy agenda at ICE and across DHS when it comes to immigration. So it seemed like, Stephen Miller has an issue here potentially. And you also have to keep in mind that we know Stephen Miller gets very operational. And what do I mean by that? He kind of gets involved in the operations of the agency. Now, traditionally, someone at that high level in the White House kind of sets like high level goals, like we want to reduce immigration, or we want a border wall or something on that level, if you're talking about this context. Stephen Miller, he calls people inside agencies at the middle level and says, you need to do this, you need to do that. Stephen Miller was the person who directed ICE to start doing these raids at Home Depot's locations in Southern California, according to the Wall Street Journal's reporting. So Stephen Miller doesn't have this defense of I'm distanced from these decisions. There's at least an appearance that he could be involved. So I wrote this story. It was very straightforward. The White House, which normally doesn't respond to my requests for comment, they definitely responded to this request. They said, look, Stephen Miller is recused. He does own stock in this company and other companies, but he is staying away from decisions that could affect, contracting decisions. So that was the story that I published. I found also a number of other White House staffers had stakes in Palantir, although they weren't, as far as I could tell, as intimately involved in immigration enforcement as Stephen Miller. But in late August, Stephen Miller did divest this stake. After my reporting, we noted that at the time, and that hasn't received much attention. But it is interesting to me that the White House felt the need to say that he was recused from all decisions regarding Palantir, yet he still divested his stake. Now, he sold at a good time to sell Palantir stock, so I don't think he lost any money. But this added this new dimension to conversations about Stephen Miller because, I personally, he has this track record of being an immigration hawk going back to high school even. But this added this element of he could be personally profiting from this crackdown in immigration and awards to companies like Palantir. And it's certainly at a minimum, added another it's not just about ideology, but there's people making a lot of money here too, including some of the people setting the policy.
You say he could be. You would have to live on a different planet if he didn't realize that Palantir is a subcontractor for the United States and working alongside ICE, and he's investing in a company that the government is contracting with. He knows all of those pieces that I just stated. He couldn't be ignorant about it. Palantir is Peter Thiel?
Yeah, Peter Thiel was one of the founders of Palantir. He was one of, its earliest investors. He's chair of the board of Palantir. And Palantir is not some minor contractor at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The technology that Palantir gives ICE really enables ICE to systematically figure out who to target, to identify new targets of arrest.
Is this social media? I'm sorry. I just want to know the technology is looking into your phone, basically, tracking your phones.
So Palantir provides sort of the analytical capabilities for ICE's investigative case management system. Now, the investigative case management system uses all sorts of data from surveillance, from other government data sets. Now they're plugging in data from the Internal Revenue Service and giving that over to ICE. That's very controversial. But Palantir basically creates the tools for government agencies and other entities in the private sector to take all these disparate data elements and make sense of them. I have my own personal story involving Palantir and Palantir's early years. I used to work at the Center for Public Integrity, which no longer exists. And we did some projects involving large data sets. We did a project. I wasn't really involved in this one, where we did looking at the subprime mortgage crisis, during the Great Recession, and looked at sort of the spread of these subprime loans to people with mortgages. And we used Palantir's technology. They offered their technology to us at CPI pro bono, and so we got to use at least earlier versions of their technology. It was you could tag different data different ways to make sense of it and try to create relational data sets, which basically it's like, how does this data relate to that data? How can you make sense of it? We used it a little bit at another project called the Murtha method, where we were trying to identify links between campaign contributors and earmarks from this powerful congressman at the time. And so, yeah, we use some of this, at least earlier versions of Palantir technology. And so inside of ICE and the U.S. Army and other government agencies, they love this Palantir technology because they just have so much data, and they're trying to make sense of it, and they're trying to use that data to advance their mission. And at ICE, that's to find undocumented immigrants, arrest them, detain them, and deport them. And Palantir makes that, it enables that on a sort of massive scale. And it is no secret that Palantir has these important ICE contracts. And ICE, if you look at the contracting records from earlier this year, it says they cannot turn to another contractor without a lapse in their operational capabilities. That was in a contracting document about Immigration OS. Because that was not competitively awarded, they gave a modification on Palantir's existing contract. So instead of opening that up for bid, they said, we're just going to go with Palantir because no one else can do this quickly like Palantir can.
Do you know how much?
Secret,
how much the contract is worth?
I believe the reporting on the Immigration OS contract modification was that it was a $30 million modification, but that's on top of an existing contract. And so the dollar amounts aren't the biggest dollar amounts, but this is sort of it's sort of like the heart and soul of the enforcement mechanisms and complex inside of ICE. It's sort of the brains, like how they're doing it. So there are different big contractors at ICE. You have the big detention contractors like Geo Group, Core Civic, and there's a few others like LaSalle. But then you've got companies like Palantir, which are creating sort of the information technology infrastructure at ICE and enable ICE to do what it does. Now, there's some information technology that's not as controversial, like Amazon Web Services provides the data backend for like almost everyone at this point in time. But Palantir, they have what are called forward deployed engineers that will go to the agency that is their client, and they'll help that agency build the sort of tools it needs to do its job. So they're training people at ICE on how to use this technology. There are ICE targeting centers. One's in Vermont, by the way, which is kind of weird because it's Bernie Sanders is one of its senators, and it's kind of a crunchy progressive state. There's another targeting center, I believe, in California. But they use this Palantir technology to do their jobs and to direct ICE's resources to this place or that place.
Well, you're describing a company that's well entrenched in the federal government. I mean, hand in glove, they work together. It's a data mining kind of company for the most part. I'm also under the impression that Doge and Elon Musk, when they were data mining in Social Security and tax information, the IRS, that's all part of Palantir's data mining itself. All that information is alongside. So it's a pretty far stretch to think that the deputy chief of staff, the president's right-hand man when it comes to immigration, is buying stock in the very company that is working alongside the government. I mean, this feels a little bit like insider trading. Do you see it like that?
It's from an ethics standpoint, it is
It's not just
terrible.
not ethical, it's illegal.
Well, so the purchase of Palantir stock apparently occurred at some point between the end of the first Trump term and the second Trump term, because we have Stephen Miller's old disclosures when he left the first Trump White House. He was not as wealthy as he is now. His stock holdings were far more limited. And I should mention that the Palantir stock was in the name of one of Stephen Miller's three kids. And Stephen Miller's wife, Katie Miller, also is very high up in the Trump administration. She was the Doge spokesperson until earlier this year. She worked in the first Trump White House. That's how she met Stephen and how they, eventually got married. But Stephen Miller certainly bought this stock, or someone at his behest bought this stock, knowing Palantir was sort of an integral part of ICE's efforts when that happened. And he did not divest that stock till 7 to 8 months into the second Trump term. And I talked to ethics experts and, quoted them in my story. One of them, who was a former acting head of the Office of Government Ethics and its longtime general counsel, he was just stunned that this would be allowed. He said, look, when you're in the kind of role that Stephen Miller is in, you don't want any questions to be raised about why you are taking certain actions. And so in this scenario, it was like the advice would always be to divest these individual stocks and companies that are deeply enmeshed in the policies and operations that you as a White House official are intimately involved in. And so he was just shocked that this was the case. And I think my story had a little bit of an impact because he did sell the stock. Yeah.
You think, is there any understanding of how much money was made or how much the stock rose since he bought stock in the company? And then when he divested?
I would need to pull the data, but one of the problems with these financial disclosures, they typically give you ranges. So the range we had is he had between 100K and 250K in Palantir stock. I should mention that if you're a federal official, it doesn't matter if it's your spouse who owns the stock or or a minor
kids,
child.
right.
It's all imputed to you. It's different if your child is an adult who's like making money on their own and has their own independent finances. But we don't have the exact number, but Palantir stock has sort of dropped in the last few months. It, had these, reached these meteoric highs over the summer and has kind of come down a bit since then. But my understanding is he sold it at probably a pretty good time in August.
Interesting. And surprise. Well, listen, we'll reference both the articles. We'll reference this one for sure. And I have a feeling that this story is not over. So you'll probably stay on this. There haven't been any ethics charges against Stephen Miller, correct? There hasn't been any investigation into him buying stock, right?
Yeah, there's no sign of a criminal investigation by the Justice Department. And that's something we should talk about, at least briefly. So this kind of scenario can lead to criminal prosecutions. Under the current administration, it's kind of hard to imagine Pam Bondi's Justice Department prosecuting Stephen Miller, for this. I will say, the divestment probably would be a factor a prosecutor would look at. Was there sort of a corrective action? But other things that a prosecutor could look at is, what was Stephen Miller's knowledge? Did he ignore advice from ethics officials? So, we have a little bit of a black box. Like, we don't really know what was going on inside of the White House. We have the White House statement that he recused himself, but it's just, given how much Stephen Miller is in the works at ICE, that's kind of hard to imagine. I should also mention that, and I failed to mention this earlier, but the Washington Post over the summer also reported that one of Stephen Miller's best friends is a high-level official at Palantir. I don't believe the article mentioned that friend's name. So there are more than just sort of financial ties between Palantir and Stephen Miller.
Smells like corruption to me. I can say that you can't. Uh, Thank you very much. I would love to continue this relationship. And as you continue to work, we'd love to elevate your stories and get you on the podcast as you do more, because I know that you will. We're covering the very same thing. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for listening to The Raid, available wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about our guests and the subjects we cover, please visit our website at theraidpodcast.org.